Let me ask you, what percentage of the atmosphere is CO2?
What percentage of the atmosphere is CO2? I don't have that calculation for you, sir.
Maybe you could tell us what your personal guess is on what percentage of the CO2.
I don't make those guesses, sir.
You're the head of the EPA and you don't know? You have all of these laws based on, you're going to get your staffer to tell you now. But you're the head of the EPA and you did not know what percentage, and now you are basing policies that impact dramatically on the American people, and you didn't even know what the content of CO2 in the atmosphere was, which is the justification for the very policies you're talking about?
Because Al Gore, the average D student, thinks that he understands climate. My God, it's as sure as gravity. He always say that. You guys are just denier, right? But to understand climate, you need to study what? Astronomy, solar physics, geology, geochronology, geochemistry, sedimentology, tectonic, paleontology, paleoecology, glaciology, climatology, meteorology, oceanography, ecology, archaeology, history. And that's not even complete. And these guys say that if we just change the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere, that we're going to control the whole system. It's a bit ridiculous, actually, right? And then when those people say that, what's the difference between weather and climate, right? They always say, climate is something like, because according to World Meteorological Organization, it's 30-year average of the weather. That may be very nice to teach students. It's true, you need to give them pedagogical aspect, which means long-term averages. But who says 30 years? It could easily be 50 years, could be easily be 100 years, right? This is all the kind of stuff that is, not quite the truth. It's only half truth, right? Do we just really want to learn half truth all our life? Half truth plus half truth, it really doesn't add to a truth, right? It's actually a pure lie. You cannot send a man to the moon like that, okay? It's a joke, actually.
Based on something that's invisible, which is carbon dioxide. You can't point to the corner and say, look what the carbon dioxide's doing over there. You can't point anywhere and say, look what it's doing, because you can't observe what it's doing if it's doing anything at all.
Well, that's not quite true. I can look at carbon dioxide and I can say it is literally the building block of life for those trees and grasses in behind you. Same with the plants and everything else that grows. So if carbon is so essential to all living things, why has it been demonized?
The point of the strategy is obvious. You can't verify it independently. You can't truth it if it's invisible or so remote that you could never get there. And examples are the coral reefs, right? They're both underwater and remote. But it isn't even the coral reef that they're blaming. It's the CO2 they're blaming for warming the world. And when you actually look into it, you find out the highest biodiversity of coral reefs and reef fish is in the warmest oceans in the world. The coral reefs evolved in oceans far warmer than today. They were much more widespread during what are called greenhouse ages, when the Earth was much warmer from pole to pole than it is today. So really, the warmest oceans of the world, which are in the Coral Triangle in the area of Indonesia and the Philippines, are a sanctuary for the coral species. The water has become colder all around the world for the last 50 million years, and causing the corals to shrink into a far smaller area than they were during the warm periods. That's the truth about coral reefs. And so when the story came out in 2016, April of, that 93% of the Great Barrier Reef was dead or dying or terminal or about to die, it was a lie. There's no way that's happening. And so for two years running, they said the reef was dying, the reef was dying. Suddenly, in the end of 2018, a few publications came out saying the reef is definitely not dead. But it was 500 publications that came out with the story of the reef is dying or terminally ill or about to die. You notice mostly they didn't say dead. They said 93% is dying. That implies it's going to die, but it doesn't state that it's dead.
You touched on polar bears. My research has led me to understand that polar bear populations are rising, not decreasing.
No, the polar bear story is a complete hoax. and fabrication. How many people know, and I ask audiences of 500 people, how many of you know about the treaty that was signed in 1973 among all the Arctic nations, ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears in the Arctic? No one has ever heard of it because the media has never mentioned it. In all these stories about polar bears going extinct, they never mention the fact that that treaty came into effect, and that is largely why polar bear populations have increased from about 6,000 at that time to at least 30,000 today. There has been no decline in polar bear populations, except during the years when they were trophy hunting them more heavily. The reason that treaty happened was because they were worried that numbers were declining. Today, the Inuit out of Iqaluit in Nunavut, where they all live, have adopted a new management plan for polar bears, which first, it allows people to defend themselves from polar bears. They would get in trouble if they killed a polar bear because it was attacking them in the past. And they've also made it very clear that the scientists from the south who come up there for a couple of weeks of the year don't know what's really going on in the Arctic. It's the people who live there year-round in the Inuit villages who know that the polar bear population has increased dramatically and has now become a threat. They have to control the bears. Now, why would the polar bear population grow if the ice was receding? And they say if the ice recedes, there'll be less habitat for the polar bears to go out and catch the seals. Well, here's the deal. The real deal is that if the whole Arctic was covered in ice, the sunlight couldn't reach the sea to grow the plankton. And if the plankton didn't grow, the fish wouldn't grow. And if the fish didn't grow, the seals wouldn't grow. And if the seals didn't grow, the polar bears would have nothing to eat. So clearly, it's not a situation where more ice is always good. There is a balance somewhere between all ice and no ice. In other words, it's good that the ice melts in the summer to let more of the sea be exposed to the sunlight to grow the plankton, to feed the ecosystem, and then for the ice to freeze back in the winter, which it does regularly, and believe me, it hasn't disappeared. And if you just look at satellite images on the internet of what the Arctic looks like in February, March, April, May, it's just covered in ice. And then it melts in the summer, and into the fall it stays fairly clear for the sun to grow the food for the bears. And that is part of the reason, perhaps, why the bear population has increased, because there's a more optimum level of ice and water ratio between the two than having the whole thing covered in ice. The main effect of the rise in CO2 is the increase in the growth of plants and trees, of everything that uses carbon dioxide as food, which is the entire plant kingdom, including the phytoplankton in the sea. The basis of the food web on all Earth is photosynthetic plants, and that is their food. I used to laugh at people who said that their house plants enjoyed them when they talked to them and grew better when they talked to them. And then I realized when you're talking to your plants, you're breathing 40,000 ppm of CO2 on them, which is their food. It's like a supersaturated fertilizer going into the air around them. And so it does make sense that plants would respond positively to talking to them because you're breathing on them.
Especially if you get up close and personal.
Absolutely. So that's the main effect of CO2 in the atmosphere. Its effect on global temperature is completely unproven. The idea that it is the control knob of the Earth's temperature, as some of the elements in NASA and NOAA are putting out, and the Canadian government follows that same line, that is a hypothesis. It is nowhere near a proven fact.
Latest climate debacle. It involves their plan to ban gas boilers, these strange, at least to North Americans, hybrid devices that heat both your tap water and your house, and instead to require Britons to adopt heat pumps en masse. Now, the problem isn't that heat pumps aren't clever. They're basically kind of two-way AC units that compress refrigerant outside to use the external air as a heat sink in summer and cool your house, and compress it inside to use the internal air as a heat sink and warm your house in winter. But they're economically dubious. I mean, if they weren't, people wouldn't need to be forced to install them. And it now turns out they're environmentally dubious as well. The German Federal Environment Agency, aka the Umweltbundesamt, says that the refrigerants involved are a significant hazard to public health and the environment because they contaminate the water. How did Boris Johnson et al. Not figure this problem out before they leapt? As usual, I think, it's a difficulty realizing that all technologies have the pluses and minuses, instead of thinking one's the work of angels and another of devils. Thus, it also turns out that these massive wind farms that are eating up vast quantities of natural space and chopping up birds and bats are also, by pulling energy from the air, changing the environment in unforeseen ways. Though one of them should have been foreseen. It's that by sucking the energy out of wind, in order to pump it into the grid or batteries, they suck the energy out of wind. Which means if you have one wind farm that's downwind of another, the one that's upwind luffs the next one. Apparently, wind farms significantly slow wind speed for dozens of kilometers, sometimes as much as 100. What's more, the ones that are placed at sea to spoil the view also reduce the amount of mixing of the sea by wave action, which affects salt and oxygen content, temperature, and nutrients.
8,000 meters, something like that. And so if we could see the temperature of that bulk atmospheric layer, we would have a very robust measurement. And the microwave sensors on the NOAA polar orbiting satellites did precisely that. And so we were the first to really put those data into a simple data set that had the temperature then for month by month since about November 1978.
Okay. And how did your readings differ from the climate science at the time?
Well, first of all, they differed because we had a global measurement. We really did see the entire globe from satellite because the orbit of that satellite is polar and the Earth spins around underneath. So every day we have 14 orbits as the Earth spins around underneath. We see the entire planet. So that's one big difference. And the other one is that the actual result did not show as much warming as what the surface temperatures showed. And we're doing even more work now to demonstrate that a lot of the surface stations are spuriously affected by the growth of infrastructure around them. And so there's kind of a false warming. We have been publishing these papers since 1994 that have demonstrated models warm too much relative to the actual climate. And yet we don't see an improvement in climate models in trying to match reality with their model output. Now, I think a number of modelers understand that, yes, there is a difference there, and it's the models are just too hot. But what is the process that's gone wrong in the models to make that is a difficult question for these folks, because models have hundreds of places you can turn a little knob, change a coefficient, and that will change the result.
PM, more than 10 times what it is today. Then the next one, the Karoo Ice Age, in the Carboniferous period, coincided with a drop in CO2, but the Carboniferous period was when forests formed. And this resulted in at least an order of magnitude more carbon in biological systems. When the forests grew, before that, everything was flat on the ground or in the ocean, and when forests grew, they sucked a huge amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, why that CO2 depletion continued is too long a story for here, but I think it had to do with the fact that there was no enzyme that could digest lignin, and it took until an enzyme named mycetes, I think it's something like that, figured out how to digest lignin, and then CO2 went back up again because all the dead trees ended up being eaten by these funguses. It's far-fetched sounding, but nobody else has an explanation for it. Look at the big red circle. This is 200 million years. That ice age, the Karoo, lasted for 100 million years. It's a logarithmic scale showing when you get closer to the present, it stretches out more, so you can see what's happened closer to the present. But that is 200 million years, where CO2 and temperature were totally out of sync with each other. When CO2 goes up, temperature comes down. When temperature goes up, CO2 comes down. And CO2 has been coming down now steadily for 150 million years. There's a reason for that. And if you look at the very tail end, on the right-hand side, that little uptick is all we have done.
And this, by the way, was unanimously approved. This specific language was unanimously approved by the scientific people who were authoring that report. No study to date has both detected a significant climate change and positively attributed all or part of that change to anthropogenic causes. Here is the way it emerged published the next year. The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. In other words, the scientists said there is no evidence that P, and what was published was not P. Now that's a pretty striking example of the politicians going in and changing what the scientists actually said. Now, I can't think of another example that is quite that blatant. And since then, the scientists have gotten the memo and basically start telling people what they want to hear, but only to some degree. Many of the scientists who have worked on these panel reports with the IPCC and in various other places have become disillusioned and have said it was the most discouraging scientific episode I've had in my life, simply because the scientists engaged in a certain kind of discussion and then the report didn't really reflect either the complexity or even sometimes the general direction of the scientific discussion.
Gruberize climate science. And what do I mean by that? Jonathan Gruber is a professor at MIT. He was one of the principal architects of the Affordable Care Act. And at one point after it was all over, he said, lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. It was really, really critical to getting the act passed. At least one key provision was a very clever basic exploitation of the lack of economic understanding of the American voter. I would assert that the same thing is going on in climate science due to a few scientists, the institutions, the media. When we misrepresent the science to persuade rather than to inform, we usurp the right of the public to make informed decisions. We distract from more urgent needs, and boy, do we have many of them. We tarnish scientific input to other matters, and then we depress young people.
Someone said, hey, wait a minute, we can't say that. Instead, after a lot of mumbly mouth stuff about why the pause is happening and we're still confident that we want to keep playing with our knobs, this sentence appeared instead. This one's even better, actually, when you think about it. Quote, these projections were not intended to be predictions over the short timescales for which observations are available to date. Translation, pay no attention to our models behind the curtain. Just trust our judgment that the end is near. The great social scientist James Q. Wilson used to say that social scientists should quit trying to predict the future because they can't even predict the past. I think the climate science community might well heed that advice. Where is the missing heat, if you want to just go from the orthodox climate theory? Most of the climatistas say it's going into the deep ocean. And while that's a plausible theory, we have very little data to substantiate it, and some data that's coming in recently suggests that it's not happening. And we have even less understanding about how that might play out in the future. Other explanations for the pause include unusual western Pacific wind patterns, I'm not making this up, aerosols, which means higher level particulates in the atmosphere, and my favorite, increased solar variation. There's this thing up in the sky called the sun. You may have seen it. And what's strange is that not an awful lot of people, not just ordinary citizens who wonder about this, but scientists even, would say, what about variations in solar radiation and sunspots? And the climate science community always says no. And their official models, if you read them, say it's a very tiny factor in any variation in the climate. And so for them now to say solar variation is driving the pause, that's interesting, isn't it?
My job is rather easy tonight because I want to talk about this gas, this satanic gas, we will call it, this satanic gas called CO2, carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide, according to the wisdom of what you call the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, that says that if you were to keep putting this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the globe is going to warm, the sea is going to rise, the polar bear is going to say, stop drinking Coca-Cola and say goodbye. And many, many other problems, by the way. Your kids will get ADHD, all kinds of problems. There will be more marijuana and all that stuff, so on and so forth. I'm here trying to tell you that this CO2 is not that powerful in that sense. The only thing it does to the system is actually make the planet greener. So I apologize if this really bothers anyone. My humble opinion, after studying this topic for close to 30 years now, that really, this quote is very meaningful. There's never been something about the scientific field that they really try very, very hard to make sure that you all don't get swayed away by people like myself, the deniers and so on and so forth, that, you make sure that you don't hear us. So I thank Independent Institute for providing this forum. I hope I don't embarrass any one of you. They really try very hard. And then every time that you say, though, you want to, I want to ask a question. No question. You just believe us. Every time you say, can we have a little debate? I don't understand your facts. Can you explain to me? They just say, no. Al Gore says so. He's presenting this talk to show that the forest fire numbers burned in the areas has been increasing. Okay? And he showed data from 1960 to about 2017 or so. And this is based on a talk with children, okay, students at the symposium in Taiwan. And I have to say that, that seems very convincing, isn't it? If you are a big authority coming from America, former, NASA director. But I think the God is angry right here, right? Something is burning. But the problem is, he's pulling such a childish sort of thing. He put actually a link to the data set where he got it from. But he forgot that the whole data set is available from 1926 or so. Why would he do such a thing, He basically, you all understand, right? He was showing you only that little part, but he forgot to show you from 1926 to 1960. Isn't that childish? Are we serious about science? And these are called scientists, right? And I'm not supposed to tell people about this? Any plants, anything that have a shell, if you have more of this stuff, like oyster and crab, they will be actually melting away because it's more acidified. It's scary. So, you know what? It's very simple. You just do an experiment. The first thing we do is that we're going to study this lobster under the condition of 400 parts per million carbon dioxide. By the way, that's 0.04%, right? You breathe out, it's almost 4%. So, let's ask ourselves, if we run the experiment 7 times more, which is about 2,800 parts per million, what happened to the lobster? It grew bigger. Oh, what's wrong with that? The second one we can test is crab, because they mentioned lobster and crab, so I'll show you that. 7 times, it's also grow bigger. I must be pulling a stunt. Remember what I just tell you. This is an experiment, actual experiment being conducted. In science, experiment means what? You, any one of us you want to do, we just go do it. Just be careful with your experimental procedure, okay? And the problem is there are a lot of these kind of scary things around that you probably have seen. I will show you one. Dissolving cell picture. You probably have seen those. Al Gore has used those, obviously. Lubchenco has used this. Jane Lubchenco, the NOAA secretary, show a picture like this from day 0, day 16 to day 45. The shell was very nice and shiny, and then it's kind of eroded away. Willie Soon is lying to you. Well, go home, refund, boy, pay money back. Unfortunately, this is another one of those magic tricks. They did not conduct the experiment that you have carbon dioxide and then it bubble through the system and then cause the change in the carbonate by carbonate cycle, so don't study chemistry tonight, but something like that. You have to study this properly. Instead, what they do is that, as I put a quote here, I better not me talking about it. These are all experts studying all this topic. Guess what they do? Instead of letting the CO2 bubble through the system, they put weak hydrochloric to speed up the process because they don't even want to wait for the equilibration of the system. Those experiments that I show you takes about 2-3 months to work properly. Okay? So, you want to hear more authoritative statements from global warming? Now let's start with IPCC, US EPA, or global change research, right? IPCC is very fond of putting out this curve. They say that on your left, you have a lot of this orange line and the red curve, they are all model calculation. And then the black curve is actually observation. They can explain everything, okay? If they include the carbon dioxide. And then on the left, this blue one, on the right. Include only the, on the right, yes. That you include only the volcano and the solar, it won't do anything because it deviates. And I have to tell you, if anybody have any understanding of statistics, this is actually an abuse of statistics. And also, statistics, I'm not interested. I'm interested in physics. you notice the unit that they plot. They always plot this thing called the temperature anomalies, which is a very strange word. It's actually a temperature deviation from some averages, okay? But if you plot in the actual temperature unit, the ice freezes at 0 degree, isn't it? The ice gets boiled at 100 degree. If you plot in an absolute unit, look, the dotted line now is actually the observation, and then the data, the model calculation is all over the place. But when you do a temperature anomaly, you actually squeeze them together, you hide it so your data look very impressive. I think rule number 1 in science is that you don't oversell your results. So in fact, they should have showed this plot, but they never ever showed this plot. It took them a long time until 2012, the first plot like such kind appeared. It has to be done by amateur scientists. They want to change the reality by using this human law, not the physical law. CO2 could never ever be an air pollutant. This is really a messy business, by the way. This is telling you something is very strange here. And then my third point is that the sun is, in my humble opinion, is primary driver of climate change, and one should study as much as possible. Again, I do not make the claim that we have found the evidence. I'm merely showing you that there's a lot of interesting hint and one should study it and understand the exact way in which the sun affects the Earth system, including sea level change, all this other stuff. And then you have to remember, climate model, that famous thing, the tools. They actually come at tool. I say it's so misleading. It's really not like knife at all, where you can use to chop, you can do so many things, including killing people. You can do so many things. This climate model is almost useless, in my humble opinion. It's supposed to be some kind of a pedagogical tool, some tool to learn, but it's not for forecasting at all. It's simply not ready, right? Because they cannot represent a lot of this physics and chemistry and all this problem. That's what the problem in climate model. It can never be used for public policy, no matter how many people say about it, no matter what the Supreme Court is saying. This is my last slide. My last slide is to quote a good friend of mine by the name of Professor Richard Lindzen, retired already from MIT because he's a bit fed up. He needs a rest. He really said that this problem is rather serious, really. He said when the historian, what historian would definitely wonder about in the future century is how deeply flawed logic, obscured by shrewd unrelenting propaganda, actually enable a coalition of powerful special interests to convince nearly everyone, except lucky few like us, right? In the world that carbon dioxide from human industry was a dangerous, planet-destroying toxin. It will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world, that carbon dioxide, CO2, the life of plants, was considered at times to be a deadly poison. Okay? I finish. Thank you.